During any election campaign, we are bombarded with polling data on the horse race numbers and what issues are resonating with the public. But are all the numbers trustworthy? What happens when the pollsters get it wrong? And just how do they get those numbers in the first place? Joining us now to help demystify the art of political polling, we welcome, in the nation's capital, David Coletto, founder and CEO of Abacus Data. He's also an adjunct professor of political management at Carleton University. And with us here in our studio, Erin Kelly, CEO and co-founder of Advanced Symbolics, Inc. David Valentin, principal at Liaison Strategies, and Clifton van der Linden, associate professor of political science at McMaster University and founder and CEO of Vox Pop Labs. And it's great to have you three here in our studio in Toronto. David Coletto, great to have you on the line from the nation's capital as well. Cliff, I want to start with you first because your lab has developed something called the Signal, which you are in partnership with the Toronto Star on during this election campaign. What does the Signal do?
So the Signal is a poll of polls. So in the same way that pollsters will go out and sample public opinion, we go out and sample the polls. And we have a series of algorithms that look to find patterns that different pollsters have exhibited across time so that we can do algorithmic adjustments to those patterns to try to use that polling data to accurately forecast election outcomes.
Let me see if I can get you sued here. Which pollsters are more reliable than others?
Well, our weights, what we call a house bias, is algorithmically determined. So we are not manually assigning weights or classifications or grades, if you will, to the different pollsters. This is done through a Bayesian hierarchical model.
Through a what?
It's a model that takes all the polls going back to 2006 and looks at how well different polling firms have forecast different elections. It looks at their sampling methodologies and how they've changed over time. And it uses all of that data to try and create an aggregate sense of what the election outcome might be based on the historical patterns of different polling firms.
Gotcha. Okay, let us look at, Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Here are four leading pollsters and some of the numbers that they have. This is the latest federal polling. I think this is as of this morning for the election campaign. Here's David Coletto's group off the top, Abacus, which has essentially got the race tied, 39-39 between Liberals and Conservatives. NDP at 11, of course. We won't go into the smaller parties for now. Liaison, that's Valentin's group over here. He's got 45-39, Liberals over Conservatives. Polly, that's Erin Kelly's artificial intelligence algorithm, 39-36, so Liberals up 3. And then the Signal has got 42-40. Now, here's my question. Okay, Valentin, can you all be right?
Well, yeah, we all can be right. I think one thing to keep in mind about most surveys is that they come with a margin of error. And so we're not saying it's going to be 38. We're saying it's going to be 38 within 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 percentage points. So if the poll comes, the poll says 38, but the actual number is 39, that's actually considered quite good.
Erin Kelly, you look at these numbers and nobody has the same numbers. So people will reasonably ask, how can you all be right? What's the answer?
It's just like David said. It's your, I can give you an example of how we create the
Please.
data to illustrate why sometimes you're going to have margins of error. So in our case, what Polly is doing, she's doing a randomized controlled representative sample of the population from social media. So we're really, we've been doing this for 15 years. So Polly does a random crawl through the graph. It's a probabilistic sample, which is the gold standard for getting the sample, and we've got millions of people in the sample. So we're very convinced that we know that we've got, and we've tested and measured, we've got a great representative sample. We know if we say they're in Ottawa, they're in Ottawa. Here's the trick, though. The ridings are different from the cities, right? So it's very easy for us or for Polly to determine that you live in Toronto and that David Coletto lives in Ottawa, even neighborhoods we can get down to. Ridings are much more challenging, right? So if you're in Ottawa and we know you're in the Glebe, do we know which riding in particular you're in? People don't usually identify with their riding. A campaign is 36 days long, so people might say, well, this candidate came to visit me, and we say, okay, that's that riding, so we've got those breadcrumbs. But we have to do those by hand. So we have to feed those to Polly by hand because they're so unusual, right? And they change.
Okay, let me follow up with David Coletto on this, because David, you've got the race tied 39-39 today. And the other David Valentin here, has got a 6-point lead for the Liberals. So again, people will reasonably ask, how can you both be right? What's the answer?
Well, I think there's always other factors in determining how we get these estimates, right? So my survey is done using online panels, and David's uses, I believe, IVR, which is a telephone survey based on an automated telephone survey. And so those, what we call mode effects, can come into the results, right? So in the case of a telephone survey, for example, I believe right now, Liberal Canadians, those who are going to vote Liberal, are more engaged right now. They're more likely to be picking up the phone, more likely to be answering the survey. So I think what we call response bias may be in part why you're seeing some of the telephone-based research being more favorable to the Liberals. On the other hand, other pollsters, like myself, make some adjustments in our weighting that might push down that Liberal vote because our NDP number is slightly higher. So there's choices that every pollster makes that might get us to different results. But in the end of the day, I think David's right that we're still fundamentally seeing the Liberals having an advantage, even if those top line numbers are slightly different.
David, do you have a view as to whether or not you get superior numbers, more accurate numbers, if you do it by telephone, off social media, off the internet? What?
Well, I think on average, my sense of it is if I'm doing a political project, I prefer telephone. But everyone has their own methodology, and there's perfectly valid reasons why online panel sometimes takes a little longer to catch up. We've seen this in other elections where there's a little bit of a lag effect. But usually in the final week of the campaign, we always more or less end up at the same place. So even though we have a little bit of a difference now, I think in the end, we'll probably be just a few points away from each other.
Cliff, what do you say on that issue of whether or not you get superior numbers? Phone, internet, social media, opening up the window and yelling at your neighbor. What's the best way?
I mean, the first thing to say is that it's not always consistent. So sometimes you get IVR panels that produce better forecasts. Sometimes they come from online samples. Sometimes they come from machine learning techniques. There's an element of randomness. So we all acknowledge that in all of our models, there's statistical error. That statistical error is a result of some of the randomness in the way that we sample. So you get variability over time. Probabilistic samples are the gold standard. The idea of a random sample where there's a non-zero and known probability of inclusion of all members of a population of interest. I think there are arguments to be made why all of us lack or omit certain people from the population, certain kinds of people, in the way that we produce our estimates, and that leads to some variability in the results. The question is, how well do pollsters know their panels, and how well are they able to control for the inevitable bias, and I mean statistical bias, sampling bias, that's present in their samples.
Okay, Erin, let me follow up with you on that, because you got criticism when you first started with Events Symbolics, when you first started the company, you did get criticism from people saying you're overly reliant on social media, which is not an accurate reflection of anything except the toxicity and hatred of society. So how do you manage all that and deal with that to make sure that the haters are not overrepresented in a sample survey?
Well, exactly. So, and that's why you sample and don't just take everything, right? And it's why you rely on people and not keywords. So every person in our sample gets one vote. So we run lots and lots of experiments on our sample. So first of all, they're not more negative than, and that's not because we choose them for their negativity. It's a randomized controlled sample, but we regularly test them because we hear people say everybody on social media is negative. Not true. What's true is that the negative people post more. Okay, and you remember them because they're so toxic.
So you have to filter that out, I guess.
Well, we don't filter it out. We do have toxic people in our sample, but they get one vote. Like, so the toxic people will be posting 50 times a day, but we count them once. We don't count them 50 times. The positive people will post once and be done with it. They also get one vote. But if you're doing keywords, you're overrepresenting those negative posts. So it's just a matter of making sure that you're sampling properly so you're not overrepresented in one group or another.
David Coletto, we all know the expression here, garbage in, garbage out. And basically that's a lead up to ensuring that if you don't ask a good question, you're not going to get good data coming out the other side. So how do you decide the wording of your questions to make sure that you get good data coming out the other end?
So it's a great point. We know that not only the wording of the question and what order do you ask them can have an influence over the responses people give. And so you've got to be very careful about that. You have to know that, when you're asking about vote intention, for example, we put it right at the front of the survey because we don't want any of the other questions we might be asking about related to policy or the leaders or the context of the election to have an influence over that final answer, because we might dig deep into one issue that might push people that they wouldn't otherwise go into the direction of a particular party, right? So I think it's important to understand that as consumers of these polls, your viewers need to understand that as the pollster, as the designer of the research, I have a huge influence over the potential outcome that we get. And so the trust that we all have around this table is really important, right? And we also have to recognize that, when we get criticized, I get criticized all the time. One day I'm a liberal, one day I'm a conservative, one day I'm a New Democrat, depends all on the results, is we're also running businesses. And so it is in our interest to get this right. If we don't get this right, then why would you hire me or David or Kelly, Erin, I'm sorry, to do the work that we say we can do? And so elections are that one moment where you can actually judge the accuracy of pollsters. And I'm really proud that in Canada, far more elections we get right than we get wrong. We just seemingly remember those ones we get wrong.
Let me follow up with David Valentin. Is this to say that if you wrote a question that started like this, who would you prefer to vote for in this election? Carney, Poilievre, Singh, May, etc. You might get a different result than if you asked, who would you want to vote for in this election? Liberal, Conservative, New Democrat, Green. Is that right?
You could, yeah. And part of that is because people could get confused. We just had an Ontario election. If you're asking people, did you vote for or would you vote for the Liberal Party? They might think you mean the Ontario Liberal Party if they're in Ontario. If they're in Nova Scotia, they might think, well, I voted PC. I still support the PCs, even though they might be voting for the federal Liberal Party.
So when you ask the question then, are you asking with party leader names or with just parties themselves?
With both, in our case.
With both?
Yeah, so if you take one of our surveys, you're getting the Liberal Party led by Mark Carney, the Conservative Party led by Pierre Poilievre, because we want to avoid that confusion. And the easiest way, when we're scripting, we're always asking ourselves, what is the respondent going through? Do they understand what we're asking? Are there any questions they could have about the question? Because if you're confused, you're just going to select, I'm undecided, I don't know. And that's not really the point of the exercise. We want to know what people are thinking.
Right. Cliff, obviously, you want to know who people are going to vote for, but what else do you want to know from pollsters?
Well, I think going back to David's point, I think you want to have a ground truth that you can measure the validity of and the reliability of polls against. You want to be able to know, I think, as a nation, that when pollsters tell us not only who's going to win an election, but also when they tell us how people feel about our healthcare system, or how they feel about military spending, or how they feel about any range of public policy issues, you want to have confidence that those inputs from the population are reliable and that they're valid, and then you want to have a sense that those who govern are going to take them seriously.
Erin, I want to pick up on this, who's going to win, because there are people already who are saying, what are we, 2 weeks into this election campaign with 20 days still to go? There are people already saying, oh, well, I know who's going to win. Is there any poll that can tell you 3 weeks ahead of time how it's going to turn out?
It depends on the election, but I don't think this is that election. So we still.
What does that mean?
You saw the numbers, they're pretty close. There are times, like in the Ontario election, we had it pretty early that Doug Ford was going to win that
election. There was no movement in the polls throughout that rip period.
That right. Nothing significant that would tilt the election away from a Doug Ford majority. So
you could predict 3 weeks to go,
yes.
Doug Ford's going to win.
Yes. We are not there yet with this one. I think we definitely need to see the debate and any effect that might have, because we know that Mark Carney doesn't speak French as well as the other candidates. He doesn't have the political experience doing a debate that I think Pierre Poilievre has, so that'll be interesting to see. But there's still a little bit. When it comes to the seat count, the Liberals are quite ahead. When it's a tie, the Liberals are ahead because the seat efficiency is much better for the Liberals.
They've got a more efficient
So they're
vote.
definitely ahead, even though they look just 3 points in the popular vote. That's what we were looking at there. When you look at the seat count, the Liberals are significantly ahead. So I think that's why people are saying that, but they're not in majority territory at the moment, so at least on our count.
David Coletto, I say this all the time, and I hope I'm accurate when I say it, so you tell me if I'm not. I always say when polls come out, they're an excellent indication of what people thought yesterday. They cannot tell you what people are going to do a month from now. Now, that is true, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's absolutely true. But you can look at other numbers beyond the horse race and try to anticipate what has to change in order for the Conservatives to win this election or for the Liberals to consolidate it, right? And so I always say, like, as much as when we put out a horse race poll, more people focus on that, I'm more interested in what's below that horse race, right? That we know that more Canadians are interested in this election than they were in the last two. We know that Mark Carney has a net favorable rating that any political leader in any part of the world would like right now. And then the question is, so what does that mean? And so, Steve, it's not that the poll that I take last week can predict 2 weeks from now, but it does tell us, both what is the strategies that these parties are doing, how Canadians are feeling about these choices, and therefore, if these don't change, which is why I would say today Mark Carney's the favorite to win, unless the public's views of him and their opponents and the issues change. And that's, I think, the real value of the polls, is we understand the relationship between believing one thing and then saying I'm going to intend to vote another way or a certain way.
Sure, but this is where, and David Valentin, let me go to you on this, this is where it can get deliciously confusing. Because let's take the recent Ontario election. Polls always showed the public was very unhappy with the current government's record on healthcare and education. And yet Doug Ford won a third consecutive majority government in which healthcare and education were barely an issue at all during the campaign. So how are voters supposed to make sense of all that?
Well, I mean, the polls also showed that Doug Ford was going to win. And I think that's what's important to keep in mind, is that we can't predict 3 weeks out, but we can predict a week out, a couple of days out. So when we get closer to election day, we'll see more surveys, and we'll be able to judge those surveys by the election results. But I think people are contradictory and complicated. Sometimes the NDP number will go up a point and the Liberal number will go down a point. And, the idea is that those NDP voters went to the Liberals or the Liberal voters went to the NDP. But it's much more complicated. There are undecided voters who became decided. There are people who were decided who became undecided. There are Conservatives who went to the NDP. There are NDP who went to the Bloc. There are Bloc people who went to the Liberals. Movement is in all directions. It's not as simple as, 1 minus 1 is equal to -2, and then a +1 here gets you an extra edge. It all flows in different directions. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind when you see the movement in the surveys.
Well, again, Erin, if I go back to the Ontario election, not all numbers are created equal, I guess. I mean, it may very well have been the case that the public was unhappy with Doug Ford's record on health and education, but they still thought it was more important that he be the guy in the chair to take on Donald Trump. And those were the numbers that ultimately were decisive at the end of the day. Fair to say?
That's fair to say, and you also can only measure what you ask, right? So, I mean, as much as you say, what do you care about? If there might be something they care about that you didn't ask, and it doesn't get recorded. Now, we've got a bit of an advantage in that because we're doing it online, so we can do entity detection. We can see what's important. And yes, healthcare is important, but it's much less important than the economy and me having a job and Canadian sovereignty at this moment, right? So it's not that it's not important. It's not the big ballot issue.
Okay, let's talk about the media's role in all of this, because Cliff, we often hear about how media occasionally, uncritically, just vomit out all of the polling data that's out there without giving it proper context, proper reportage, whatever. What are the media's responsibilities during these writ periods?
Well, I think when it comes to polling in particular, I think it's important that audiences are given proper context around polls, that movements within the margin of error are not represented as substantive shifts in public opinion. I also think that we see real effects from how media represent polls and how they speak about polls. This has an effect on the ground in how people think. So we can take the example of the 2011 Canadian federal election, which really the big story out of that election, among other stories, was the orange crush in Quebec, the surge of NDP voters. Well, many people attribute that surge to Jack Layton's appearance on Tout le monde parle. But if you look at the time series data, you see a small increase in Quebecer support for Jack Layton after his appearance on that television show. But where you see the big surge, what we call a discontinuity in the regression analysis, a big break in that curve, is when 3 polls were released several days later. Crop, Leger, and Nanos all released a poll on the same day saying there was a shift in support for the NDP. And then you saw, after that, a huge jump in Quebecer support. Whether there are different causal mechanisms that we can attribute to this effect. It could be that Quebecers took a little bit of time to think about or contemplate their potential vote for the NDP. It could also be that when they felt that other Quebecers were warming up to the NDP, it had this affirmation effect or this validation effect. There are different explanations, but the descriptive statistics are there. The media portrayed these 3 polls as a signal that the NDP was moving ahead, and it actually amplified the NDP vote in Quebec in that election.
Conventional wisdom, David Coletto, suggests that that is a very Quebec-based phenomenon, that when Quebecers see the train leaving the station, they want to get on it. Are you able to tell us the different characteristics that perhaps voters in different provinces tend to have in elections over the years?
Well, I don't know if there's a tendency, a regional one that way. I think what we know is that in this case, let's talk about this election. I don't see any real regional dynamics at play. I think this has become a national election campaign in which 1 or 2 issues are dominant. And whether you live in British Columbia or Ontario or Atlantic Canada, you're reacting to very much the same things. Now, I think there's some subsets of that more by generation, actually, than by region, and which I think is the real story. And that's driven by how we get information, Steve. It's not so much where we live, but if I'm tuning into the agenda on TVO, then I'm going to probably be also watching news on other broadcast news outlets. But if I'm under 30, odds are I'm not watching your show, Steve. And if I am, it's because I'm watching clips on social media, or I'm getting most of my news on TikTok. So I wrote a piece just today that basically said, like, this is 2 or 3 elections at once, not because of where you live, but actually about where you get your information. And if you're under 30 right now, this isn't really about Trump or tariffs. This is about affordability and housing. And if you're over 60, it's the only thing you're talking about, and that's Trump and tariffs. So regionally, I think there's always some dynamics, and sometimes a national election becomes much more regionalized. But in this case, you've got a national election that's much more driven now by differences in how we get our information and the role that fragmentation in that information ecosystem plays.
David Valentin, let me get back to the issue of media. What are you looking for when you see how media report on the huge variety of polls that are out there?
Well, one interesting thing is that our firm works with the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada, and they represent most of Canada's non-English, non-French media. And so it's great to talk to editors and reporters who maybe sometimes don't have as much experience in covering surveys, and not only sort of give them the numbers, but also walk them through, here's how the survey was done, here's what this means, here's why a trend line is more important than any specific snapshot. So we're looking to see the media replicate that also in the English and French press, which for the most part they do. I think what we also see now, though, is that there is a cottage industry of people who are writing blogs, who have very long threads on X, who are on Threads, who are creating TikToks, covering the election, covering the surveys, and sometimes they don't cover it in the same way that traditional media does.
What's your view, Erin, on whether or not polls reflect public opinion or move public opinion?
I actually was interested in talking a little bit about how the media reports.
Okay,
too,
follow
if
up
I
on that,
could.
sure.
I think when we report how a poll was conducted, 19 times out of 20, 95%, I don't think anybody understands what that means, and I think there's a big misconception about what that means. And I think that's why a lot of people think, oh, the polls are wrong. 95% confidence doesn't mean there's a 95% probability that this is what the result will be, right? That's not what it means. It's actually got to do with peer review and repeatability of an experiment. So I think we do a disservice in how we report the statistics. It's really the margin of error that matters when it comes to a political poll.
But when we say 19 times out of 20, that means there's one rogue poll that's going to come every now and then, doesn't it?
No, that's not what it means. That's not
what
what it means. It's a big, complicated thing, but it means that if I were to do I'll use the example in medical science. If I do a vaccine trial or any kind of trial, I do the trial in Oakville and I get 95% of people are protected against the disease. But then I do it in Hamilton and I've got a 50%. it's not within my confidence interval. It's an indication that the methodology used is not repeatable. So I'll do it again and again. Is it repeatable? It's really there for scientists to figure out whether or not the experiment you did was valid in the first place. It's a peer review kind of, or a repeatability experiment. We don't repeat our political polls, so it's not really that relevant. What's relevant is the margin of error, but because we have to put it at a 95%, this is what media often, I've actually had journalists tell me, oh, well, we want it at 95%. But if you bring down the confidence, you can actually say, there's a 68% chance that this is the result it's going to be, and you don't overlap the margin of error. So it's a bit of a mathematical thing, but you would actually get more interesting polls if you did that. But we're sort of tied to this. It's kind of like why are the tires on the car the width that they are? It's because of chariots and Roman times. Like, this is why we're doing it this way, because that's the way we do it in like medicine and stuff, but it's not as relevant in a political poll. So anyway, just that's like a whole different conversation.
Okay.
Your question
about moving public opinion versus reflecting public opinion.
Yeah, I think it reflects public opinion. There's actually what Cliff mentioned to the side. I haven't looked at that one, but generally speaking, there's been a lot of studies, peer-reviewed studies, that have looked at whether or not polls change public opinion, and we look at that too. Here's the thing: people who watch political polls judiciously are probably pretty interested in politics, and they know who they're going to vote for, right? It's not the polls. Their family might influence them, but it's not the polls that's going to influence them, I don't think. And people who don't pay that much attention aren't using the polls to make their decisions. So there hasn't been evidence that, I think the polls are a reflection for the most part.
What about, okay, well, I'll ask Cliff this then. If you're publishing the sort of, grand analysis of what all the pollsters are basically suggesting, how do you know that by doing that, you are not encouraging people to kind of stampede over to the winner if it looks like party X is going to win the election, or conversely, stampede away from the winner because they're terrified about that particular party winning? How do you know?
There is a risk. There is a risk there. I mean, if you look at the 2015 Canadian federal election, you saw the lead position change hands among each of the three parties. The NDP had the lead going into the election campaign. According to the polls, it transferred to the Conservatives, and then after the last leaders' debate, the Liberals took it.
This was Mulcair, Harper, Trudeau.
That's correct. Tom Mulcair himself, after that election, attributed some of that decline in NDP vote share to polls and media coverage. So there, to the extent to which there's empirical evidence in that particular case, that's a subject for further discussion. But nevertheless, the idea that polls can influence people's vote, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it is possible, and it does happen in certain cases. But it also maybe should happen in certain cases. We, in Canada, our electoral system, as you know, is a single member plurality, or first past the post system. And so sometimes people vote strategically. They vote not necessarily their first order preference, but they vote in order to ensure that they keep another party out of the win in their riding. To do that, they need credible on-the-ground data of how the parties are performing at the riding level. And I think, as all of my colleagues have indicated, that is the hardest part of polling in Canada, is taking that swing model that happens at a national or regional level and applying it at the seat level. Let
me get David Coletto on that as well. How much strategic voting, based on what you folks put out there, do you think happens during elections in Canada?
I think it happens quite a bit, and I think the polls do help provide information to voters who are looking for an outcome, right? Let me use an analogy. It's like going to a restaurant, right? You've got a set menu, and you ask the waiter, what's the most popular thing on this menu? And that information might cause you to pick that item that waiter mentioned, or you might say, I don't really like that. I'm going to go with what I was going to go with anyways. But I view polling as more as just other information that the media can share with voters who are trying to make a decision. So if your goal in the 2011 federal election was to stop Stephen Harper from winning that election, and you found out that the NDP now were gaining in Quebec and maybe elsewhere, that might have caused you to go, okay, well, that's the alternative who can beat Stephen Harper. And I do think that's what happened when that orange crush in Quebec spread to a lot of the other parts of the country. So I, obviously, as a pollster, I'm not going to say what we do is detrimental. I think, though, it does impact. It's another source of information that voters consider. And Steve, I'll say one more thing. It's not so much that most Canadians are tuning into what Abacus is saying or what Liaison is saying about the state of the race. They don't even know what our companies are mostly. But it's the influence that the polls have on folks like you, Steve, who are reporting the story, who are making the choice that says, well, the NDP is at 8%. So I'm going to write an endless amount of stories about how in deep trouble they are, as opposed to reporting on what they are actually promising Canadians to do. And so I think in that way, there's an indirect effect on elections through the way that media cover that election, as opposed to the voters themselves knowing exactly what the polls say.
Well, that is a great point, which makes the numbers that we put out there at the top of the program all the more problematic as we try to understand what narrative we in media ought to be telling. We're going to write very different stories, or presumably broadcast very different programs, if it's a tied race as opposed to the Liberals with a 6-point lead. So, David Valentin, what are we supposed to do with that?
Well, let me just pick up on what David was saying. You know, polls are just one piece of information. You might walk around your neighborhood, and if you see NDP signs everywhere, come to the conclusion, hey, the NDP are doing really well in my neck of the woods. Or you might talk to your mom, and she might tell you, you know, I just met the NDP candidate, and they're fantastic. At the same time we're doing the polling and that viewers are seeing polling results, they're also getting campaign ads. They're also getting mailers from the political parties. They're also seeing all this different activity.
But do you have an outsized influence? I mean, yes, campaign drop literature is influential, signs are influential. Polls are really influential,
Polls are influential to us, to I think the same extent that we shape media coverage because we give more information about why things are taking place. Why is a leader in Alberta? Why is a leader in Quebec? Why are they in Trois-Rivières? Right? Because we know from the polling, oh, okay, you know, we see that there's a close race in Quebec. We see there are close numbers in Montreal. We see there's opportunity for a different party in Winnipeg or Victoria, right? And so the tours give you information based on where people are going, but where they go is informed by polling that the parties themselves are performing.
Yes.
Right? So it's this endless feedback loop. But at the end of the day, we're gathering data independently. We're putting it through scientific processes, and we're doing the very best that we can each do. None of us go into this with the intention of shaping a result. We want to know what people are thinking and accurately represent that.
Erin, last minute to you, and that is, what do you worry about Polly missing, not picking up?
Well, here's the thing with Polly. Think of her as she's got open ends, right? So we don't have an IVR where it says press 1 for Carney, press 2 for Polly. You know, so she's reading all of these conversations, and that's our science, is classifying all of these conversations. So the big part that we worry, you know, like one area of research that we have is what's the difference between political sarcasm and humor, right? Like if you post something from The Onion, you're not necessarily making a statement, but if you're posting something that is sarcastic, it could indicate that you favor one candidate over another. So figuring out those nuances, that's the hard part of what we do, because we can't just bucket people easily. Well, we do. We have to bucket open-ended statements as leaning this way or that way.
Artificial intelligence still not great at picking up sarcasm or nuance?
Oh, she can get the sarcasm.
She can.
It's it's humor versus sarcasm. Sarcasm, yes. Sometimes it's just humor, though. It's not political.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, listen, I'm one of those people who can't wait to see what the polls are going to do over the next, how many days we got left in the rip period? 20 days or so still to go. So bring it on, folks. Let's see your numbers. We want to keep going. With thanks to David Coletto in the nation's capital for joining us on the program tonight. And here in our studio, Erin Kelly, David Valentin, Cliff van der Linden. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.